Imagine you're on a boat way out at sea. In front of you is a very large island with towering green trees and a whole bunch of creatures that you don't recognize calling from the forest. Suddenly, from the horizon of the trees, bursts a massive creature. This creature rivals the size of your boat, and your heart jumps in your chest. It appears to be a large bird with a wingspan of 20 feet. In its grasp is a large elephant, which it carries up into the air and drops all the way down to the ground with a large crunch. The rock, someone whispers beside you. The what, you say? The rock. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Mythic Wilds. It has been quite a while since the last time I talked to you guys. We went over the story of Old Ephraim, and I had a lot of fun doing that, but I thought that the podcast needed a little bit more personality than just me reading a script. So we're going to spice things up a little bit before we jump into the story of the rock. Just a few things to note. If you enjoy mythical, legendary creatures from the Earth's history, or even today, check out the links in the description. I got 2 links for you. Our Discord community, where we can talk about creature theory in there. You guys can give me ideas for episodes. You can help me with my research. And another link, which is Patreon, where you can do the same exact thing, but you can submit a community story, which I will cover here on the podcast, or a myth that you've created yourself or heard that's been passed down, or you can submit a theory over there that I might talk about on the podcast as well. And you can also help support Mythic Wilds. So without further ado, let's jump into the rock, one of the most amazing mythical creatures in Earth's history. All right, so just a brief overview of the rock. It stood 20 feet tall, and it was said to have a 100-foot wingspan. I know in the intro I said 20 feet wingspan, but a 100-foot wingspan was what the descriptions had it as before. It was known to cause storms with its wings, and the word rock originates from the French translation of Arabic of the word rook. The legend was extremely popular in mythology in the Middle East, and it has endured for thousands of years at this point. As a kid, I found large birds extremely interesting. I used to look towards the mountains and hope I would see something massive, a dragon or a giant bird flying above the peaks up there. I think it's part of our culture to want massive birds ruling the skies, however terrifying that would actually be. So let's dive in to the story of the rock. The first character in our story is Sinbad the Sailor, and he's the one that kind of gets the ball rolling, at least from the records that we have remaining from this time period. The story goes like this. Sinbad is stranded on an island and then discovers enormous eggs, which he thinks is the rock. Trying to escape the island, he ties himself to one of those eggs. The rock carries him to the Valley of the Snakes, and these birds are large enough to devour elephants, right? So the snakes are also giant snakes in this story. And the snakes are also the rock's prey as well. So the rock doesn't just exist in Middle Eastern culture. In Persian mythology, there's something called the submerge. It's also a giant bird that also eats giant snakes. So we're starting to see some themes come together here. In Hindu tradition, there's the Garuda, which is a divine eagle-like being and a king of the skies. Again, this bird also battles large snakes. And it also shows up in some historical-esque type records as well, if you can call it that. The next person to encounter the rock in the history that we have remaining is Marco Polo. And he encountered the rock in the 13th century in Madagascar. He describes the rock as an eagle of enormous size. He said that its wingspan was 12 paces long and extremely thick, which was probably about 9 meters or 30 feet long by today's standards. To put that in perspective for you real quick, the biggest wingspan on Earth today is the wandering albatross, which has a wingspan of 3.7 meters or 12 feet. So we're talking about a bird that has a wingspan 3 times the size of today's largest wingspan on Earth. Marco Polo also claimed that the rock could lift an elephant and drop it from the skies. So I personally don't know if a 30-foot wingspan could lift an elephant, but that's an absolutely incredible claim to make. The only problem is that no elephants ever existed on Madagascar. Marco Polo describes that the feathers could be mistaken for large sails. The feathers were so big that you could confuse them for the sails of ships. All right, so what do I think about Marco Polo's story here? It's obviously contradictory, right? We know that birds aren't big enough to carry elephants, first of all, unless they're mini elephants. We also know that Madagascar didn't have any elephants at all. So what is Marco Polo talking about? We'll get into that in a little bit when I break down what makes this story real and what's kind of embellished. There are many other accounts that talk about the rock's ability to carry elephants into the air, also picking up whales out of the sea and dropping them to eat as well, and again, the giant serpents. Back to the snake thing real quick. The only fossil evidence that we have of giant snakes in the Middle East come from millions of years ago. For example, Gigantophis garstini is an Egyptian snake that lived around 40 million years ago and was 36 feet long. It was so big that it devoured crocs. But this is nowhere near the size of the mythological rock story that we're talking about. We know of another giant snake known as Peleophis colossal, which lived in North Africa, that's near Egypt as well. It lived 50 million years ago and was 40 feet long. This snake also lived in the sea, which is kind of cool to think about. So a giant sea serpent, but it didn't live during the time period of any human beings on Earth. I just want to put this out there as well. I'm not disrespecting the legend or the mythology of the rock. The stories typically have a symbolic meaning rather than a literal meaning, but I do like to know what inspired that symbolic story to begin with. And honestly, there's actually some good evidence to support the fact that people could have thought there were giant birds on Earth, because there kind of was. First of all, what's Marco Polo's problem? Why is this historian, who is relatively respected throughout history, making up a whole bunch of hogwash? It's kind of a misunderstanding, actually. So Marco Polo actually wrote about the rock in the third person. He didn't see it himself, and his work is extremely embellished. Most likely what happened is he heard the story from sailors, which begs the question, where did the sailors get the story? But Marco Polo did not see the rock, and sometimes it's perceived that he did, even though that was never the case. It was also to make it more appealing to medieval audiences. People loved storytelling, and if you were extremely boring with your stories, like, oh yeah, there's an eagle that's about an 8-foot long wingspan, most likely people wouldn't care at all to listen to you. So to make stories interesting, they embellished and they made them interesting, kind of like we do today, to be honest. Marco Polo spread the story throughout the West, and honestly, this is how a lot of stories have spread across continents, through sailors and early world travelers. So you see these themes, right? There's the Thunderbird in North America, there's the rock in the Middle East, and they have very similar thematics. That's because people were traveling the world a long time ago, and a lot more often than we probably know about, and spreading these stories throughout the continents, creating these similar thematic elements that we can find across cultures. So here's the big question, right? Did the rock actually exist? And obviously the answer is no. The rock did not exist, but there's two real-life creatures that inspired the stories of sailors on Madagascar. The first one is Apiornis, also known as the elephant bird. This was a massive flightless bird that lived on Madagascar about 1,000 years ago. So this is during Marco Polo's time period. It stood almost 10 feet tall and weighed 1,100 pounds. It's potentially the largest bird to walk the earth ever. Here's a fun fact for you as well. The closest living relative to the Apiornis is actually the kiwi, which lives in New Zealand. And if you know anything about kiwis, is they're extremely tiny. So these birds, after millions of years of evolution, ended up shrinking down to the tiny size of the kiwi. Also, Apiornis eggs were extremely massive as well. They were 13 inches tall, about a foot tall. The eggs were, and they were huge. So anybody encountering these massive eggs on the island could easily think, this is the rock's eggs right in front of us. There's one major flaw to this story though. The Apiornis couldn't fly. So what were they seeing? What were these giant eagle-like birds that were flying over Madagascar? Enter in the Malagasy crowned eagle. Today, this would be about the size of a female golden eagle. So a very large eagle species. They're absolutely huge. They were so big, in fact, that they would eat lemurs, and I'm sure that sometimes they would pick these lemurs up and drop them from the air. They actually survived into the 16th century as well, and they went extinct due to habitat destruction. The problem is this still isn't big enough to be, I think, even exaggerated to the size of the rock. So what's also going on here? Well, there's something called the moon illusion. I don't know if you've noticed, but whenever the moon is on the horizon in the sky, it looks way bigger than it looks when it's up in the air. The reason this is the case is that your brain is using objects in the surroundings to generate the size or perceived size of the moon. So when it's on the horizon, you're looking at it with, a reference that makes it look way larger than it actually is. Your brain literally enlarges the object for you to make it make sense. When the moon's up in the air, the size doesn't change absolutely at all. It's just an illusion. It looks bigger on the horizon, but it's actually just the same as you've always been seeing it. So an eagle flying on the horizon on Madagascar would look a lot larger to human beings than something soaring directly overhead. It still happens to birders today. Those of you that don't know, I'm a birder in my free time. I also run a bright-eyed birding channel, 2 of them actually, that talk about birds, and birders are constantly getting size wrong out in the field. We constantly cannot perceive how big an object is without any form of reference. If a bird is soaring, it looks smaller. If the bird's on the horizon, it looks bigger. So combining these 2 factors, the Apiornis eggs with the Malagasy eagle and the horizon point of view, I think we have our culprit right there. The problem is this doesn't exactly solve all giant bird folklore. The Middle East have the roc. The Americas have the Thunderbird, which is a colossal bird that brings thunder while flying, which is a story for another day. I promise I'll get to it sometime. But we need to deep dive into a little bit of the mythology that makes the roc so special to cultures. Giant birds are often seen as protectors or guardians of the planet. They battled giant serpents or giant snakes, which is symbolic of battling evil from the underworld. They protected humanity from danger, and they were linked across continents by seafaring travelers. To explain the unexplained, people created these stories. Sometimes we do that today. We constantly, as human beings, want to believe and want to think that there's some type of higher power protecting us. Also, to explain the unexplained, people created theories, not unlike I'm doing right now. I'm trying to explain something that we can't really explain, and so we come up with theories to make sense of all of it. Most mythical creatures find their roots in real creatures. Then those real creatures become embellished over time. Mammoth skulls become evidence for cyclops. Storytelling just naturally leads to embellishment. For example, Old Ephraim, the story that I went over last episode, 6 months ago, sorry about that, is based off of a real bear, but they embellish the details like its height and its weight to make it larger than life. But here's the real question, is the roc still prevalent today in our society? Absolutely it is. We see this creature in video games. I believe it appears in Dungeons and Dragons, and never done it before, but people tell me that it's in there. J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle Earth has giant eagles that are also protectors and helpers in times of danger. And then even on social media, you still see videos pop up of eagles carrying off giant creatures like deer or bighorn sheep and then dropping them. The roc is part imagination, but also part reality, and it's also part symbolism. I hope you enjoyed that story of the roc. I recognize that this podcast is a little bit shorter than I would like them to be on the channel, but I do want to make mention that that's not always going to be the case. Like I mentioned earlier, you can join my Discord community or my Patreon to help make this podcast more interactive with you guys. I want to hear your stories. I want to hear your theories. I want to hear ideas for episodes that you have. So definitely jump into the community or join us over on Patreon. I have a few other segments that I want to throw in at the beginning of this podcast as well. One is creature versus reality. We're going to compare a legendary creature to a real world comparison. And then again, those community stories, myths, theories, and questions as well. You can submit questions. Also over on Discord and Patreon, I would love to hear your feedback. How do I make this a better experience for you, the listener? So without further ado, let's dive into one of these segments that will be in the beginning of an episode in the future. I already mentioned it briefly, but mammoths and Cyclops, the relationship there. Many of you probably know this, but in ancient Greek myths, there is a one-eyed Cyclops, right? It shows up in a lot of different mythological events. It's in Disney pop culture, Hercules. It's also in Percy Jackson and the Olympians, the book. Cyclops are absolutely still prevalent today, and maybe we'll run into an episode on one in the future, I'm not sure. But where did this come from? It actually arrived with the discovery by ancient Greek people of mammoth fossils, specifically dwarf mammoth skulls from the Mediterranean islands. So if you've ever seen a mammoth skull without the tusks, it looks like a large skull with a big singular eye cut out in the middle. That's what it looks like to me when I look at it. And to ancient peoples, this could easily be confused for a big eye socket right in the middle, right? So they actually thought that they had discovered the Cyclops. That's where that story comes from. And I think it's really, really cool that ancient, prehistoric animals like mammoths were the inspiration for mythology. And it's just what I'm trying to do on this podcast, right? We are connecting mythology and mythical stories of creatures to real world creatures. Don't forget to follow me over on Instagram. I'm at Mythic Wilds. And if you like birding as well, you can go check out Bright-Eyed Birding Learn. Remember to join the Discord community down below. I've been sitting in there patiently as I've prepped all this stuff ready to release, so I can't wait to formulate a little bit of a community in there as well. Remember that you can also go join over on Patreon, where you could submit your theories, questions, or stories about legendary creatures, and they might be featured on the show in the future. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history and folklore. If you enjoyed this episode of Mythic Wilds, be sure to subscribe for more tales of legendary creatures, untamed lands, and the mysteries that still roam among us. Until next time, stay curious, stay wild.